We left off last time with Charlemagne. Charlemagne built up the biggest empire Europe had during the Middle Ages, an empire that took care of what is today France, most of Germany, and northern Italy, including Switzerland, and some of what is today Austria, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Quite a large empire. During his years in office, he undertook some 54 military campaigns. Don't worry about the number. Most of them were against the Saxons. The Saxons fought him fiercely, and he defeated them. His government system, he tried to govern his domain from horseback, and he would move around, followed by some of his nobles from one place to another. They would camp at night, then get up the next day and try to get to another place where there was trouble. And again, he tried to govern from horseback. Because he never set up an efficient government system, he guaranteed that the rulers who followed him would have a lot of trouble. But he realized that his orders needed to be written down, because his orders often got changed from the time he spoke them to his servant to the time they got to the knight or the count who was supposed to receive them. So he set up a public school for the nobles only, I mean the sons of the nobles. He told his nobility, send your sons to my school at my expense, and this was the beginning of free public education in Europe. It only applied to nobles, but he wanted to be able to have his orders written down to where there could be no mistake about what was written. Now, again, his government system, though, was inefficient. In the year 800, he was down here in Italy, and the Pope sent a crown on his head and crowned him emperor to the Romans, and it was the first time a non-Roman had been crowned Roman emperor. A German, he was, for all practical purposes, Charlemagne was a German. He was now Roman emperor. Even though he could neither read nor write, he was interested in learning, and this interest was to eventually spark an intellectual revival in Europe. All right. When Charlemagne died, the word Charlemagne, by the way, means Charles the Great. This kingdom was divided among his grandsons. I mean, he only had one son, but that son had three sons, and they divided them. Then those three kingdoms were divided further. And after a while, the office of king got to mean less and less. Eventually, now the European nobility learned to give their title only to the oldest son, one son, and the rest of the sons make knights out of. But at this time, every one of his sons or grandsons became king. The kings began fighting among each other, and after a while, then the nobility began to get more and more power, and after a time, even the nobles began to keep armies. Again, this reminds you of Roman times, where every wealthy person in Rome had his own army, except for Cicero, who said he didn't believe that he should have an army, and Cicero wound up being banished. But every duke, every count had their own troops. Part of this was necessary because Europe was at this time being invaded by foreign invaders. The three groups that invaded during the days after Charlemagne, during the days of Charlemagne's weak successors, the Muslims, the Magyars, and the Vikings. Now, I'll save the Muslims to last, but starting with the Vikings. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, and they began to spread down from Scandinavia, and we're not sure exactly why. It might be that they resented the European missionaries that were being sent to them from this part of Europe, but they began to spread terror wherever they went. The Viking ships, so they were excellent seagoers. The Viking ships were pointed at both ends, And they typically had monster heads on both sides. The purpose, of course, was to scare away sea monsters. Now, we have found one original Viking ship that somehow got stuck in ice and been preserved for a while. But they were afraid of sea monsters, but they believed that these fierce-looking heads on each side would scare the monsters away by being the same on both ends. Now, if you looked at them from the top, they were streamlined to where they could go in either direction. In other words, they could go up the river and go down the river without turning around. They hung the shields of their ships on the sides, and again, they usually had one big sail. They spread terror everywhere they went in Europe, and one of the most dreaded things the Europeans could see was a Viking ship coming up the river. No one knew where they might pull in and drop anchor and go around and set ablaze to everything in sight and carry off all the plunder they wanted. Now, on another note, the Vikings are known to have drifted over here into Iceland and then into Greenland, and then even southern Nova Scotia, and Viking artifacts have been found as far inland as Minnesota. We now know that they actually did settle here on this island because we have found we found a village. They lived in a fairly small village. The year was around the year 1000. Now, they began spreading out from Europe even while Charlemagne was alive, and around the year 800. But by the year 1000, they had come to what is today Canada. They had also settled in Greenland. They left North America owing to the fact that they simply could not stand up to the Indians. Yes, the Vikings did have steel armor and steel swords, but the Indians greatly outnumbered them. Now, that was to change 500 years later when Europeans were to come back to North America. But the Vikings, just simply brave and bold as they were, could not handle the vast numbers of Indians that there were then, because the Indians numbered more then in the year 1000 than they did in the year 1492 when Columbus came. Now, this land is called Iceland, again named by the Norsemen, but Greenland was discovered later. And a lot of folk felt like they deliberately misnamed it. But actually, I think that the climate started to warm up around the year 900 and 1000. And this land actually was a green land. And the Vikings were farming here in Greenland the same way they had farmed back in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. They were farming, and it worked. And then in the 1300s came an ice age. And these Vikings living here did not know how to handle the ice. The Eskimos, they looked on as being demons, Freylings they called them. They would not deal with the Eskimos, but the Eskimos knew how to handle this climate. The Eskimos never had it better, but basically the Vikings froze out. And when the Vikings came back 200 years later, in the year 1500, they found their colony. The last persons who had died in their beds with nobody to bury them. The Eskimos never bothered them. The rest of them had died. Anyway, that's a separate story all to itself. But the Viking colony in Greenland died out owing to climate change. We also have more evidence of climate change because the grapes that they grew here, today these same grapes, from what they described, these same grapes will grow no farther north than New Jersey. But indicating that there was definitely a climate change, and the climate cooled drastically in the early 1300s, which led to the Black Death in Europe, big plagues in China, thousands, millions of people dying in India, led to a big, and probably a whole lot of people dying here among the Indians also. That was to come later. Anyway, the Vikings eventually converted to Christianity. Now, the Magyars. The Magyars were another group from Central Asia, in other words, basically from Mongolia, or Inner Mongolia also. Some of them came from what is today Turkestan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, these countries that once made up the Soviet Union. But they came and they threatened Europe. Europeans finally got together and decisively defeated them. Then the Magyars went and settled in Hungary. I mean, the Huns were their distant cousins. So they found refuge in Hungary. They settled down there. And they also converted to Christianity and became part of the European culture and European scene. So the Vikings mixed in, Magyars mixed in. Now we come to Muslims. No, the Muslims never did blend in that well with European civilization. The Muslims were living in North Africa and they continued to hit from Spain. They also for a while took over Sicily. They tried to take over Constantinople, so they were fighting from the east and from the south and a little bit from the west. Basically, folks, Europe was being hammered from all sides. From the north were the Vikings, from the far east were the Magyars, from the south and west were the Muslims, and things looked kind of dark for Europe. Now, Europe was able to defeat all these foes eventually, get two of them to mix with them and become part of them. The war with the Muslims is still going on. And it's a real war, and it's still going on. I need not remind you of that. They will not mix, they will not blend in. And folk, I took a course on the Crusades 40 years ago, and at that time my teacher was Pope Arad. And he was everything about the Crusades was all wrong. Everything. The Crusades was one of Europe's worst moments, and nothing good about it. And we would get together and talk about how that, we just didn't care that we got the Holy Land back from these people. It didn't matter. That was 40 years ago. Today, I think we better understand why the Europeans take the offensive against Islam, because they were simply picking up the ball and carrying it to the enemy territory. Instead of waiting for the enemy to keep coming to them, they took the offensive and struck the enemy in his own territory. We can also, I think, better understand why Queen Isabella. We've criticized why Queen Isabella ordered that all Muslims be driven out of Spain, and they all were, and sent to North Africa. Today, I think we can better understand. We can better understand why wars are fought, even when you don't want them. What we're engaged in, folk, is a war that I feel like we did not start, but we have to fight. And it's a war that if we're not extremely careful, we, and I'm talking as a Westerner, are not going to win. Because we're not willing to get up and fight it the way wars have to be fought. Anyone have a comment? Yeah.
I mean, you see that with France recently, and then France going to bomb whatever, like they're fighting it, but
They're fighting harder than they did, but the question, I have a fellow part-time fireman who raised this, but how come they didn't fight them hard until now? And in our case, I mean, what it's going to take, we're going to have them hit us with a lot more severity than they hit on 9/11/2001. They hit us pretty hard then, but they're going to have to hit us with a lot more severity before some of us wake up and realize, hey, they're everywhere and nobody knows where they are. Now we're going to have to do things that in general we don't like to admit we have to do. Such as seal our borders. Hey, the first thing France did was seal its borders. Well, France was such a liberal country that until the first attack, almost every French policeman did not even carry a gun. They have no standard ground laws in France. In other words, a cop doesn't even have the right to defend himself if he's attacked. Now, they're about to change their ways. They actually secure their borders right after the attack. Israel did some things that the rest of the world considers illegal. Israel put them all in fences and said you can't come out without being sniffed with dogs and bomb-sniffing devices. And Israel stopped the suicide bombings. Oh, we can't do that. I mean, we criticize our grandfathers for putting the Japanese in camps during World War II. I don't criticize our grandfather for doing it because every American alive in 1942 agreed with it. Your history books will tell you that every American alive had agreed with putting the Japanese in prison camps until the war was over. Today we're soundly condemning ourselves for it. But folk, we're about to start understanding why our ancestors behaved the way they did. It's starting to make more sense now. You either conquer people or they will come and conquer you one way or another. It's either you or them. Again, we criticize conquest as being evil. But guess what? The bad guys are there. And they'll get you if you don't get them first. Anyway, we're going to be talking more about the wars that the Islam made. What came out of this, so for Europeans to cope, the Europeans set up a system called the feudal system. There was something like it in India for a while, there was something like it in Japan, but Europe had the most famous feudal system, and it lasted almost about 800 or 900 years. Essentially, a feudal system features a weak king, and the power is in the hands of the nobility. Each noble will pay lip service to the king, but then he will go out and do his own thing. Each noble person has his own army, his own fighting men, his own knights. And oftentimes nobility fight each other while the king sits by helpless, unable to do anything about it. What would happen when nobody planned it, the Europeans, but a man would realize, hey, between being attacked by the Vikings and the Magyars, I can't defend myself. So he would find a powerful neighbor and say, hey, I'd like to join with you. And the man would kneel down and swear an oath of fealty. He'd swear that I will protect you, and then in turn the Lord would swear I will protect you. And they would swear oaths of loyalty to each other. And this was a system called vassalage. Now, when I was in high school, my brother checked out a book from the library entitled The Crusades, and I read it, but I'll never forget the opening statement. First sentence, it says, if you had lived in Europe during the Middle Ages, you would probably have been someone's vassal. Everyone in Europe was a vassal. The Pope was a vassal to God. The king was a vassal to the Pope. The dukes were vassals of the king. The counts were vassals of the dukes. The knights were vassals to dukes, kings, their overlords, whoever their lord was. And the serf was a vassal to his lord. A few freemen might not have been involved, might not have been vassals, but nearly everyone else were vassals. Vassal means, you were agreed to be in the service of the person who is over you. Noblemen might actually be vassals sometimes to more than one person. And the kings of England were actually vassals of the king of France, even though the kings of England said they were not inferior, because the kings of England, through marriage alliances, inherited some land in France that they were to keep until after the 100 Years' War. But to become a vassal, you'd swear an oath of loyalty called fealty. Fealty, an oath of loyalty, and you would kneel down and do homage. The homage means basically kneeling. This was a system, such as it was. It was a rough and tumble system. The Lord eventually would grant you some land. As the Lord began to collect all the land, he would grant land to his vassals. The land he granted became known as a fief. Again, this is a foreign word. Now, during this time, Europeans learned how to cross certain types of horses to get larger horses. And in addition, I also think the European male became smaller in size as they they practiced a lot of inbreeding. In other words, they would not marry their first cousins very often, but they would marry someone to whom they were related to on their father's side and related to on their mother's side, and maybe on their other grandfather's side and another grandmother's side. Or they would marry inside their community, or the nobles would only marry other nobles, which meant that after a while, European males got smaller and smaller. We can tell from the size of the armor that we still have. We have a lot of armor from the Middle Ages, and it shows the average size of the European male was only about 4'6". Now don't get me wrong, they were not all that small. King Edward I, we dug up his bones once, and he was about 6'3". Peter the Great was 6'7". Henry VIII was almost 6 foot tall. Some of them were very large, even by today's standards, but most of the men living in that day were short. Between the larger horses and smaller men, knights came on the scene. The word knight generally means horseman. The knights were to dominate Europe's battlefield for, some 500 years. Now, with the invention of gunpowder, or the introduction of gunpowder into Europe, knights became outdated, outmoded, but that was to come later. For 500 years, a lot of times your knights would fight battle after battle without getting killed because their armor protected them. How did one become a knight? Well, first of all, he had to be the son of a nobleman. I said a nobleman would typically only make his oldest son a noble, give the title to his oldest son, but also that noble would become a knight. And then all of his other sons would become knights. You started off at 6 when you became a page, and that's when your education began. At 14, you became a page, and that's when you learned how to hunt, use weapons, and engage in play fights with other fellow squires. Another thing a squire had to do was, because the stirrup had not been invented, a knight needed some way to get on his tall horse, so the squire had to get down on all fours, and while the knight used the squire's back as a means to mount his horse. And that could not have been very pleasant for the squire, because nevertheless, and also the squire was taught chivalry. I'll have more to say about chivalry in a minute. Anyway, when he has turned 21, after spending a whole night in prayer, provided he did not slip up along the way to show cowardice or something, he would become a knight. And he would remain a knight until he retired, if he lived that long enough to retire. Now, as chivalry, that was the ideal of the medieval knight. Basically, it had to do with a knight's conduct toward women, code of conduct in the Middle Ages toward women, and some people have gone so far as to say that this code of chivalry was one of the things that propelled Europe to heights. Basically, the Europeans had the ideal that they did not always live up to, that women were to be held in respect and honor. Particularly, the worship of the Virgin Mary did a lot to elevate the status of women. Even though women were considered subservient, not considered equal, nevertheless, people were told they were to be respected. Now, typically, a knight would become a lady's champion, and he would fight her battles for her. The most famous case of this was a case of Lancelot and Guinevere. Guinevere was married to King Arthur, and Lancelot was the most powerful knight in the kingdom. So he became basically, Guinevere became his lady. The relationship between the knight and his lady was supposed to be platonic, because a knight could never pick his own wife as his lady, even though in the case of Lancelot and Guinevere it degenerated into not platonic. The result was King Arthur's entire army was destroyed, but that's folklore more than it is history. But nevertheless, it was still part of the standard of the time, where that a knight protected his lady, fought her battles for her, avenged her every time she was wrong, etc., etc. And it set up a code of conduct. Part of that code was You were about to cross a foot-long bridge, and there's only room for one person to cross. If the knight saw that the other person about to cross was a woman, the knight would step aside and let the woman cross first. But if the person about to cross was a man, the lesser man, weaker man, was supposed to step aside. The story about Robin Hood and Little John, and Robin Hood was trying to cross a foot-long bridge at the same time Little John was, and neither one of those men would back down, so they met in the middle of the bridge and engaged in a shoving match, and Robin Hood got knocked into the water. But he got up, and he and Little John became fast friends after that. That was not always the case. But anyway, chivalry led to such things as a man should hold a woman's coat for her to help her put it on, or a man should hold the door for a woman to help put it on. And more than 50 years ago, in my high school class, we would discuss whether or not chivalry were dead. Each of you can decide for yourself if chivalry is dead or not. But it was the code of conduct in the Middle Ages that some people believed helped to elevate women. But yeah, part of the code of chivalry was that the man pays if he asks a woman out. Again, I don't know how strong that custom is these days, but I do know that about 30 years ago, I asked a woman to go with me to Stone Mountain. I had been at Lockheed for 7 years, so I was pretty well off financially. She was unemployed and flat broke. When we got to the entry to the gate, of course, the guard demanded I pay, or hey, shove money. She said, "You mean this costs money?" I said, "Yeah, I knew it was going to cost money when I asked him out here. I expected to pay." "Oh, no, I want to pay my share." I said, "Well, you don't have to." I went to Lockheed the following day and discussed this with some of the single men there, and one of them said, "Yeah, I've had my dates do that to me too, and I don't like it." A lot of the men didn't like it either. You women just be advised. Anyway, be that as it may, I mean, each of you have to decide for yourself what you have. Either way, as far as this woman goes, the last count I had of her, she never had married. Be that what it may. She was someone by not letting me pay, even though I had plenty enough money to pay her way in. She was sending me a message basically sending me a message that she was not my girl, and also sending me another message that she probably never would be. Anyway, yeah. But again, is chivalry dead? That's something I really don't want to get into too deep of a discussion about. The knights would build castles. Again, if you've ever played chess, you'll run into these same terms. Castle. Those of you who play chess know what a castle is on a chessboard. A knight, the knight has privileges that other players on a chessboard do not have. And of course, the bottom were the foot soldiers, the pawns. Then, of course, there's a king and queen, and the religious figure, the bishop, all of which make up a game of chess. Some of you may know something about it. Some of you may not. Anyway, most of your religious leaders, particularly bishops and archbishops, were from a noble family. Typically, a noble family might have 2 or 3 sons, and he'd make the oldest one the next lord after him, after the father died. The second one might become a knight, and the next one might serve the church in a form of bishop. But almost all your high-up church officials were members of the nobility or came from noble families. Tournaments. If you go to the Renaissance Festival, which I think is held every September or every fall somewhere south of here, you'll see knights in armor galloping at each other, trying to knock each other off the horse, except in the Renaissance Festival it's fake. The fact is, this is now known to be a very, very dangerous stunt, and it crippled a lot of knights permanently, killed a bunch of them. But they would play their war games by galloping at full gallop with spears and shields, and they would try to knock the other knight off the horse. Sometimes it only involved 2 knights, and sometimes maybe 50 knights would get on one side and 50 on the other, and the side that won was the side that still had the most horsemen on their backs when the clashing was over. As time went on, though, the tournaments became safer and safer, because the knights were expected to stop before they actually clashed, rather than hit each other at full gallop. Any of you know what I'm talking about? Tournament? Okay, yeah, okay. if any of you have been to the Renaissance Festival, you've seen them, but at the Renaissance Festival, they're faked. These knights know in advance which one of them's going to fall off the horse, and he falls in such a way that he doesn't get hurt, and the ground he falls on is usually padded. So, and the armor also is somewhat fake. But anyway, it's a safe act, the way they do it. Now, women in the Middle Ages. I've already mentioned how that in general the status of women in Europe was higher than it was in a lot of places. I mean, Europeans did not force women to burn themselves up when their husbands died, and Europeans did not generally kill their unwanted baby girls. So it was higher than a lot of places, not as high as it should have been. But women were expected to be subservient to their husbands. However, a lot of times their husbands were away fighting a war, and when their husbands were away, the wives were expected to manage the estate. So wives had to be skillful in managing servants, managing finances. And some women actually eventually became dukes, duchesses, and some actually eventually became queens. They inherited the throne in the absence of male. Now, a lot of places had laws that women were not allowed to inherit the throne. Eventually this was changed. The most famous woman of the Middle Ages was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Essentially, Eleanor's father was a Duke of Aquitaine, which was one of the largest duchies in France, even larger than the king's own private domain. And Eleanor was orphaned before, and she was still what we call a preschooler. So at the age of about 4, she was the only child of her parents. She became the Duchess of Aquitaine. Well, the King of France arranged for her to marry his son, Louis VII. And here was a problem Louis VII had. Louis VII was actually the second child of the king. So the king, Louis VI by name, said to Louis VII, you go to a monastery, your brother's going to get the throne. Well, all of a sudden the older brother died, and that meant that Louis VII had to be called out of the monastery and prepare himself to become king. Problem was, Louis VII never did get over the fact he'd once been a monk, and Eleanor did not like him a bit for this reason. I thought I was marrying a king, and here I found out I'm marrying a monk. Anyway, we're married, Eleanor and Louis, and Eleanor did not produce a male heir, for which the king, Louis VII, blamed her for not producing a male. Now today we believe, I don't want to say we don't know anything, but we believe that the father determines the sex of the child. The father passes on the chromosome that determines whether or not a child be male or female. But in those days, they believed that the woman determined the sex of the child. So a king particularly tried to marry a woman who had a lot of brothers, believing that a woman who had a lot of brothers was more likely to produce a male heir than a woman who didn't. Today we would think of this as being Gilgamesh, but nevertheless, this was what they thought at the time. But in the case of Eleanor, the king had married her because she had all these lands. And he thought somehow she'll produce a male heir. Well, she never did. Then King Louis went on a crusade, the Second Crusade, and he made the mistake of taking his wife with him, and his wife took some 50 ladies. And these ladies, in amongst these thousands of men, behaved in a very licentious manner, and I would behave in a disgraceful manner. I don't want to go into detail. And Eleanor herself was accused of hopping from one man to another. The tensions between Eleanor and her husband became so great that finally the two of them, on their way back, when they abandoned the crusade, they went by way of Italy to get to France, and they went to see the Pope. The Pope tried to get them to reconcile, but there was nothing to be done. The marriage was shot. So when Eleanor got back home, her first act was to leave her husband Henry and take her lands with him. Eleanor then married the King of England, Henry II. And yes, you might have guessed it, once she was married to Henry II, she bore Henry II 4 sons. And to think that Louis had divorced her because she didn't bear any sons, and then she married this other man and bore him 4. Again, Philip Augustus, though, not Philip Augustus, Louis VII wound up marrying another wife. He got rid of Eleanor on 2 grounds, called consanguinity. He claimed that he was too closely related to her. And the other ground was that she had had an affair with her uncle. And of all the affairs that she is accused of having, the one with her uncle might have been the one that was least provable. Nevertheless, it's likely that she was morally a loose woman anyway. But she married Henry, and then she got from Henry 4 sons, but also she got a very unfaithful man in Henry. Henry was a philanderer himself. All right, what am I getting at, folk? A lot of persons believe that the idea of romance can be traced back to Eleanor. Before her time, people married persons who they were told to because it would increase the family's prestige, or they married for practical reasons. They married maybe by choice, but they did not marry because of a feeling toward each other necessarily. In the case of Eleanor, she got up the idea of romance, that love is a feeling you have, and you follow your heart. In other words, wherever your heart leads, that's where you go. You can, and if your heart leads you from one partner to another, that's okay. This idea was passed on down through the ranks, through the generation of Paris, and became especially bad at the Palace of Versailles in Paris under the kings Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. Louis XVI had a wife named Marie Antoinette who was accused of infidelity, among other things. Louis XIV and Louis XV were never faithful to their wives. And it is said that this scene eventually took over and captivated Hollywood. Some of you might know a lot more about this than I do, that Hollywood movie actors and actresses follow where their emotions lead, and typically are not faithful to their marriage vows. But the idea was that love is a feeling, and once that feeling goes, it will never come back. And you follow after your emotions, wherever your emotions lead, you follow. Now, having said all that garbage, I wish I had some soap, but I'll do the best I can to clean my mouth out. There's some things, folks, I do not believe and I do not like. To me, love is a decision you make, not a feeling you have, and you make the decision based on fundamentally sound wisdom and not on emotion. But a lot of people today act like it's a feeling, it's an emotion, and you follow your heart, and the result is more than half the marriages in this country end up failing. She engaged in rebellion against her husband Henry, and Henry put her in prison for a while, but when Henry died, her sons took the throne. There were 2 sons, Richard and John, and they released her. All right, so much for Eleanor, and so much for the Hollywood scene. Yes, when I was in graduate school, one of the books I was required to read was the biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine. It was titled Eleanor and the Four Kings. The 4 kings were her first husband, her second husband, and 2 of her sons who became king, King Richard and John. All right, now we'll talk about the growth of European kingdoms. For the most part, the power of the king was very limited. However, some kings in this period were outstanding, so we'll start with England. The first king that we'll talk about, now he was far from the first king, but the first one that we'll talk about was William the Conqueror. Known as William the First. Now, if the present Prince of Wales, Prince William, ever becomes king, he'll be known as William the Fifth. There have been 4 kings named William. This one was the first one. William the Conqueror, in the year 1066, and don't worry about the date, but he conquered England. All right. William, as a boy, William was Duke of Normandy, by the way. Normandy was the word Normandy came from Northmen. So William was descended from the Vikings, but nevertheless he had a little bit of blue blood in his veins. In the meantime, England was ruled by Edward the Confessor, and Edward the Confessor and William had been playmates as a boy, and Edward had promised, when I die, I'll give you the throne. Well, Edward died, and the people of England gave the throne to man named Harold. The problem was Harold had no blue blood in his veins, meaning that Harold had no kingship in his ancestry. It was not simply kings. William was. So William said, I feel like I'm the rightful heir to the throne of England. So William collected together all the men he could find, and they invaded England. And it was to be 900 years before England was invaded again. The next time England was invaded, it was invaded by Hitler, but Hitler lost. But anyway, William led an army. He met with Harold. In a battle, Harold was killed by an arrow, and William then became the King of England. William set up a fairly strong monarchy, and England then, unlike the other places in Europe, England had a series of strong kings. Unlike France and Germany and Italy and Spain that all had weak kings, England had a fairly strong king, beginning with William. Now, folks, don't write this down. This is a little bit of trivia I'm going to throw in. I always learned this morning. One of the men who William collected to fight for him was a man named Warnebald. We don't know for sure where Warnebald was from, but probably from the land of Flanders right here. In other words, what is today Holland or Belgium. So if we think he was a Fleming. Warnebald followed William, and when William won, Warnebald was given land up here in the northern part of William's territory. The people living in this territory had the surname of Cunningham, so Warnebald took the surname Cunningham, and his descendants would become a noble line with the surname Cunningham that lasted until 1802, when the last male heir of the Cunningham nobility died off without issue, without heirs. But the Cunninghams became fairly famous noblemen, and there's a family, there's still a county in Scotland called Cunningham County. Again, a little bit of trivia that only I would be interested in, but I always throw it in at this point. All right, William conquered England, set up a tax system, helped make the English crown fairly strong. The next king of now he was not the next king after, but the king of consequences was Henry II. Now actually there were a few kings between William and Henry, but Henry was a strong one. Henry was the one that Eleanor married after she divorced her husband. Henry II got the same idea that one of our presidents, Woodrow Wilson, had. President Wilson wanted to move our country towards the left, towards socialism. So Wilson decided that, hey, what I'll do, I'll take over the courts, and I'll get the courts on my side, and then through the courts I can rule like a dictator. And you might be aware, folks, that our courts make all of the nation's moral decisions. You might say, can't the court's decision be overturned? No. We had one that was overturned in 1912, income tax. They can make a decision 5-4, and it's the law. And Congress cannot overturn it. The states cannot overturn it. The president cannot overturn it. If that sounds like democracy, then I'm a monkey's uncle. But that sounds more like dictatorship to me. I mean, they can make decisions. And there was one, though, they made it was kind of overturned. In 1972, they ruled that the country must use buses to achieve racial integration, and neither blacks nor whites wanted it, so both sides eventually just ignored it. Nobody complained. There was no watchdog group to complain, so the busing has since been eliminated, not by a court decision, but just simply by nobody obeyed it, and nobody protested when it was not obeyed. That's an exception, though, but for the most part. Anyway, Henry decided he could take over the royal courts, and he imposed his law then on the judges, got the judges on his side. The local courts were weakened. The king's courts became the law of the land. However, there was a big problem he ran into. And that had to do with an upstart named Thomas Becket. And that had to do with the church. The church said that only they should try cases that involve churchmen, clerics. Henry said, no, this is a matter for the state. If the cleric commits a crime against the state, it's going to say, and I should try clerics. The church said, no, only we should. There are other issues as to who would appoint officials. Henry claimed that he, as king, should appoint church officials. The church said they should. Today, with all respect, churches appoint their own officials today. And I have to say, I think they should. But in those days, some people felt the kings or the nobles should appoint them. Well, finally, the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's the highest church office in England. The Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant, and Henry thought, I have a chance. So he appointed his, you might say, his drinking buddy, who was not really an avid church man. He'd been a very worldly man, but he appointed Thomas Becket. You never can tell what a man will become when you're making something. Thomas Becket all of a sudden became one of the most devout churchmen you'd ever seen. He started to dress like a churchman, talk like a churchman, and worst of all, from anyone, he started to think like a churchman. And he took the church's side on every issue. And even the Pope wrote him a letter and said, in effect, the Pope said, hey, Reverend Becket, kind of tone things down. We don't need this fight. I mean, that you're provoking. Just kind of cool it. You'll get your way eventually. Just have patience. Thomas Becket refused to back down, even against the advice of the Pope. He stood up to the king. Well, one day the king was sitting around his table eating a meal with a bunch of his knights around, and someone came to him with a note here. This is Thomas Becket that said this, Your Majesty. Henry had a vile temper. Said, all you dogs who sit around my table, can't any of you take care of this upstart for me? Well, he probably just was blowing off steam. I mean, probably never, there were 4 knights left the table, taking him at his word, went to Thomas Becket, and basically one of them put a sword into Thomas Becket's skull, and Thomas Becket's brains were knocked out. But this proved to be a terrible setback for Henry. All of Europe rose up and condemned Henry for this act against a churchman, an innocent churchman. They said that Henry had to apologize for it, then he had to go before the next archbishop and do penance for the deed. And basically, Henry lost his fight with the church, at least for that point. He simply did not dare make another move against the church. And if you visit England today and go to the Westminster Abbey, you'll find a statue of Thomas Becket, the man who stood up to the king and became something of a martyr. Henry had to succumb. Well, the next king after Henry, when Henry died, and this one really was, he passed the throne to 2 sons, Richard I, known as Richard the Lionhearted, and John. Now, you notice I didn't put a number after John's name. That's because the royal family does not name its sons John. The one they did name John turned out to be, they simply dislike. If there's ever another John, this one will be called the first, the other will be called the second, but there hasn't been one in 800 years. But anyway, Richard, there were 3 Richards. Richard I spent his 10 years away, 9 of his 10 years away from England, most of them fighting the Crusades. When he couldn't win the Crusades, he came back home. There he was captured by a duke in Austria and held for ransom. Eventually England paid the ransom. Richard got back home but was killed by an arrow shortly after. Died without heirs, so the throne went to his brother John. John goes down in history as being the most wicked king England had. He was subject to throwing fits where he'd completely lose control. I mean, almost like an epileptic seizure. And he'd roll around the table, and even the dogs would bark. I mean, would run away from him when he started throwing his fits. But he would act like a mad dog, foam into the mouth, throw fits, throw things, and everybody would just leave the room when he pitched his fits. He buddied around with a bad crowd. I mean, all told, he was known as being the most wicked king England ever had. Well, all right. One day he went to France because through his mother Eleanor, he'd inherited her duchy, so he was also the Duke of Aquitaine. He went to France to take care of affairs in France. Then, while in France, he began to hear rumors that the people of England were getting up a charter. Now, here's the story, folks. Keep in mind, in the Middle Ages, there were no assassinations. Hardly any. There was one that occurred in Austria somewhere, but most of the time when a man would get down on his knees and swear loyalty to another man, they were not assassinated. The English nobility were not planning to depose John, and even if they were to depose a king, when they deposed a king, they usually put him away in a monastery. They were not planning to depose a king. They simply were saying to John, you are still king, but there's some things you may not do. So they got up a document called the Magna Carta, otherwise known as the Great Charter. This Great Charter limited the power of the kings. When John saw that all of the nobility were against him, he signed. The date was 1215, the year was 1215, the place was Runnymede. Don't worry about that. I had to learn that when I was younger, and if you take advanced world history, you'll probably wind up learning it yourself. But he signed the Magna Carta, and some people believe that this was the beginning of England, number one, limiting the power of its kings and leaning towards democracy. And England became the cornerstone of European democracy and led the way toward European democracy. And English democracy very, very strongly influenced American democracy later. Now, King John carried his entire treasury around with him in one big cart. And one day this cart was on a boat crossing the Thames River, and the boat capsized, the treasure was lost. This is a little bit of trivia I'm throwing in. It's not in the book, but nevertheless, it's one of the big mysteries. What happened to the treasury? It's now estimated it's probably buried under 20 feet of silt, and the English have said that the English crown has said if it's ever found, it belongs to the crown. Nevertheless, King John was so upset he died shortly afterward, died mostly probably of a broken heart from having lost all of his money. And folk, again, you're asking for it if you do that. Put all your eggs in one basket and keep that basket with you wherever you go. You're asking for it. Eventually, kings learned to keep the money in the banks where it was somewhat insured, or put it in several banks to where one bank would not lose it all. Next king of any consequences was King Edward I. I've mentioned him. He was about 6'3". But anyway, Edward I. He went on a crusade, but what we remember him for? A couple things. Number one, he conquered Wales. Wales had become independent of England under the other kings. Wales is here in the western part of England. But he was determined to have all of the island of England for himself. So he never got around to conquering Scotland. Scotland was to remain independent. But when he conquered Wales, the Welsh were all concerned. They said, we don't speak English, and you're going to send us a man who speaks English. And the king promised them, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll guarantee you, I'm going to send a man to be your ruler who doesn't know a word of English. So who did he send? He sent his 6-month-old son, who didn't know how to talk yet. This 6-month-old son became the Prince of Wales. And every king from that day to this has given his heir apparent the title Prince of Wales. Well, the Welsh people were really flattered to receive the baby. I mean, after all, hey, they didn't want anyone who was low-born. That would have been an insult. But who in the kingdom was any higher born than the heir apparent, the oldest son of the present king? So, yeah, he was only 6 months old, but when the people of Wales received him, they received him with open arms, and again, they were flattered to get him. And he became Prince of Wales, and again, that day to this, every heir apparent has a title Prince of Wales. Now, the other big achievement that Edward had was he convened the first Parliament. Because of his conquest and the armies he raised, he found himself in need of money. Now, a king cannot go into business and raise money. The only way a king can raise the money he needs is through taxation. Well, the king realized that if I impose the tax I want without the consent of the people, they'll rebel. So he just got the brilliant idea, hey, I'm going to gather all the nobility into one place, get them under one roof, and just explain to them, here is why I need this money. I have this expense, I have that expense, I have that expense. Do you approve of me raising your taxes by so much? So he got them together in one place. This was the beginning of Parliament. And after a short time, English kings did not dare raise taxes without Parliament. Now, one king did try to raise revenue without Parliament. Charles I, he had his head chopped off. But English kings from that day to this will not raise taxes without Parliament. In our own Constitution, we have a clause in the Constitution that only the House of Representatives can initiate tax laws. The Senate cannot initiate it. The Senate votes on all tax laws, but the Senate cannot initiate a tax law. All tax revenues initiate in the lower house. Anyway, this is the beginning of Parliament, and eventually Parliament became, when I was a child, I learned the United States has Congress, England has Parliament, a lot like our Congress, where the people get together and pass the laws, make the laws. Today's kings are expected to sign them whether the king likes the law or not. It's been 300 years since an English monarch refused to sign a law passed by Parliament. The Queen's name was Queen Anne, but that's another story. Anyway, this is the beginning of Parliament, and in fact, Parliament in the next generation, King Edward I was followed by Edward II. Edward II was so worthless that after 20 years, Parliament turned him out of office. Again, they didn't kill him. They simply said, go to a monastery and live out the rest of your life in a monastery, and gave the throne to Edward II's son. Let's see, Henry III, I believe. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But, anyway, Edward I is remembered for conquering Wales for one, convening the first Parliament for another. All right, we're leaving England and going on to France. The Carolingian kings became very weak after a while, due largely to inbreeding. And after a while, the people of France said, hey, this Carolingian king we have is too, I don't know what word to use, but too inept. So I'll just say inept, incompetent to govern. So they put him in a monastery. And they got together and elected a king named Hugh Capet. And he started the Capetian dynasty. Now, their first dynasty was the Merovingian, then came the Carolingian. Now we're back to the Capetian dynasty. However, elected kings usually don't have much power, and the kings of France were really pathetic in their lack of power. They had a small domain around Paris, but Hugh Capet pulled a fast one on them. He used the biblical principle where that when David was about to die, David had his son Solomon crowned while David was still alive. So Hugh Capet said, this is a precedent set in the Bible. So when Hugh Capet got old, he had his son crowned. Now what was supposed to happen was when Hugh Capet died, the people of France were to elect a successor, whomever they chose. Instead, Hugh Capet had his son crowned. In turn, that one had his son crowned. And in turn, that one had his son crowned. And for the next 15 or so generations, all the Capetian monarchs had their sons crowned while they were still alive. And this guaranteed the Capetian dynasty would become a real dynasty, something that the people of France, the nobility of France, had never intended. Now, the first king of note of the Capetian dynasty was Louis VII. I've already mentioned how that he went on a crusade, L-O-U-I-S, pardon me. And he married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Well, but he was far eclipsed by his son, Philip Augustus. These kings, after a while, they became more and more powerful. Particularly one reason they became powerful was the bands of outlaws were just all over France, and also a lot of nobility was some of the chief outlaws, and the nobility were fighting each other. And a lot of people in France just said, who should bring order? And in fact, in the case of Louis VII, he was sitting around discussing how terrible things were in France, and the clergyman he was talking to, the priest said, well, hey, wait a minute, how come you're talking to me about that? You're the king, you should do something about it. So the king then decided to pick on the most wicked nobleman in his realm, the most evil, and he won. Then he picked on the next most evil nobleman in his realm, and he won that one. Basically, I say picked on, but he conquered a few of the worst of the nobles. Then he died, and his son Philip Augustus continued that, basically bringing a more powerful central government and less chaos. Now, I want to tell you a story, though, about Philip Augustus when he was 16 and still quite foolish. He was allowed to hunt because, after all, he was the crown prince, the only son that Louis VII had. And one day he went into the woods on horseback alone, which in itself was foolish enough. And while he was passing by a certain farmer, the farmer said, hey, sir, you have a nail that's coming off of your horse's shoe. And then the crown prince stopped. I'm not going to stop my hunt for a nail. It's not worth it. So the crown prince said, keep the nail, my good man. You might be able to use it for something on your farm. Just keep it. So the nail came on off. The farmer picked it up. And the saying was to go around, save a nail, bad or worse, someday it may fill your purse. The nail wound up filling the farmer's purse because the king gave the farmer a crown, a title of nobility later, not a title of nobility later. So this nail wound up filling the farmer's purse. But anyway, as for the prince, he went into the woods. Because of the one nail that was missing from the shoe, the whole shoe came off the horse. When the shoe came off the horse, the prince was able to pick up the remaining nails, but the horse, of course, in order to have a horse, they have to put their weight on all 4 feet or they're simply helpless. The prince had to dismount and do his own walking. The night got cold, the prince got lost. And the prince began to develop a very high fever. Fortunately for him, the horse was able to lead the prince back to the farmer that had found the nail in the first place. The farmer was able to get that nail and some other nails and put the shoe back on the horse. And then the farmer realized, hey, this young man is the crown prince. So the farmer naturally sent word to the old king, sent word to the government, hey, I have the crown prince in my household and he's very sick. The old king was just beside himself with terror. Nevertheless, they were able to get Philip Augustus back home, and Philip Augustus was slowly restored to health. As for Louis, the priest told him, you must visit the tomb of Thomas Becket in England. Well, Philip was willing to be, Louis was willing to do anything to get his son William. So he visited the tomb of the martyr Thomas Becket, and while there, he actually talked to Henry, who had stolen his first wife from him. But neither Henry nor Louis had a quarrel with each other anymore, and all that Louis could think about was his son. Anyway, Philip is eventually restored to health, and he became a much wiser man for the ordeal. And it became a saying among the people, because of the nail, the shoe was lost. Because of the shoe, the horse was lost. Because of the horse, the prince was lost. A couple of sayings emerged from this. Shortly afterward, Louis VII had his son Philip crowned, and that might have been a big mistake for him. Not that Philip was incapable, but Louis's health declined really fast, folks. Now, I want to warn you what I've heard about retirement. My dad died 11 days after retired. Retired July 31st and killed from a heart attack on August 11th. Bear Bryant, famous Alabama coach, retired 1 month and died the next. Retirement seemed like for an older person, when your body hears the word retirement, your body thinks, oh, life is over, and starts shutting down. Anyway, right after Louis VII had his son crowned, his health began to fail rapidly, and in short order he was gone, and Philip took over the throne at 18. Philip is remembered for setting up a tax system that was to, he like Henry, he increased the power of the royal courts. The tax system was to increase the wealth of the king also. The kings after him learned how to tax through the Estates General. In other words, they could raise taxes if they got Parliament to consent. Philip also participated in the Third Crusade alongside of Richard I, which we'll talk about later, so keep these men in mind. But Philip quickly abandoned the crusade and made Richard very upset at him. The crusade probably would not have done well even had Philip been around. All right. The next and last king of France, don't remember. Now, folk, I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you, but you will run into these names if you study history, and even if you don't, you'll probably, throughout your life, you never know when you'll run into these names again, and you really need to know them. The next one was Philip the Fair. Philip the Fourth, otherwise known as Le Beau, or Philip the Handsome. Philip the Fair, in this case the word fair meant handsome. It didn't mean just necessarily. Philip the Fair is remembered for instituting the Estates General, which was the equivalent of Parliament. And the purpose was to get the nobles together to meet, to agree to tax laws, to give the king the power he needed, the authority he needed to tax. All right, I'll stop here, and I'll keep Philip in mind because I'm going to be talking about him when we come to the subject of the Crusades in a little bit, but for today, I am out of time. All right, everybody, I hope to see more of you than I do on Wednesday. And I congratulate those of you who came to class. I wish I could reward you for it, and I've heard some teachers do. I've been told I cannot, but anyway. Thank you for coming to class, and I'll try to make it as worthwhile as I can, and I'll see you on Wednesday.